Welcome back to Odd Occasions, where we explore the strange, forgotten, and bizarre corners of history. Today, we're diving into the shadowy world of America's most lethal highwaymen, criminals who terrorized roads and travelers long before their stories faded into obscurity. From murderous brothers to ruthless gangs, these are tales of greed, revenge, and cold-blooded crime. So buckle up, because we're about to take a wild ride through the dark side of American history that time tried to forget. Number 10. The Doan Brothers. The Doan Brothers were responsible for a series of robberies, shootouts, and jailbreaks that plagued eastern Pennsylvania between 1781 and 1788. Many historians believe these crimes were fueled by one thing: revenge. Before turning to a life of crime, the Doan Brothers were members of the Quaker faith. But during the American Revolutionary War, the Patriots took possession of their father's land. In retaliation, the siblings abandoned their peaceful roots. What followed was a descent into drunkenness, violence, and organized crime. Eventually, they formed a gang with at least 30 members. One of their most notorious heists? A robbery at the Newtown Treasury, where they made off with a staggering £307. And despite the best efforts of the authorities, that money was never recovered. But the Doan brothers' reign wouldn't last forever. Their fortune? It quickly turned. Levi Doan and their cousin Abraham were hanged in Philadelphia. Moses, the eldest, was shot and killed. Aaron Doan also met his end by the noose. Of the surviving brothers, 3 escaped. It's believed Mahon fled to England after escaping a Baltimore jail, while Aaron and Joseph headed north to Canada. And that's the story of the Doan brothers, whose bloody path of vengeance left a trail of chaos, fear, and bodies. Stay tuned, because we're just getting started on this dark road through history. Number 9. Ben Kuhl. On December 5, 1916, just outside of Jarbidge, Nevada, the United States witnessed the last horse-drawn stage heist in its history. It was a day that would leave its mark not only on crime, but on forensic history as well. Fred Searcy, the driver of the Caballero first-class mail stage, was found gunned down, shot in the back of the head. The culprits fled the scene, making off with $4,000 worth in gold coins. But it wasn't long before the trail of clues began to unravel. Authorities found a bloody envelope and a discarded black overcoat near the crime scene. The coat, identified by local residents as belonging to Ben Kuhl, a drifter with a troubled past and a long criminal record. Kuhl was quickly located and arrested, along with 3 of his friends. One of those friends would later turn on him and testify against him. But the most damning piece of evidence came from that bloody envelope. For the first time in American history, a court introduced palm prints as evidence, which ultimately sealed Kuhl's fate. Despite being sentenced to death, his sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment. In April 1943, at the age of 61, Ben Kuhl was finally released from jail. But he wouldn't live long as a free man. Just a year later, he succumbed to tuberculosis and passed away. Kuhl's story may have ended, but the legacy of that bloody palm print lives on in the annals of American justice. Number 8. Joseph Thompson Hare. In 1790, Joseph Thompson Hare began his journey from Pennsylvania to New Orleans. Along the way, he crossed paths with 3 like-minded individuals: cunning, ruthless, and deadly. Together, they formed a gang that would leave a bloody trail across the countryside on their way back north. Disguised in a truly terrifying manner, they painted their faces with dark berries, giving them a gory and grotesque appearance. designed to strike fear into anyone who crossed their path. As they moved from town to town, they robbed and murdered more peddlers and farmers with brutal efficiency. Along the way, Hare and his crew encountered various groups, even engaging in trade with Native Americans. At one point, they obtained counterfeit passports, which led to their imprisonment by the Spaniards, accused of being American spies. But it wouldn't be long before fate began to take its toll. After being released, Hare began experiencing disturbing hallucinations. One vision in particular, a magnificent white horse, would prove to be his undoing. Following yet another crime, while being pursued by a vigilante posse, Hare saw the apparition. Stunned and stopped in his tracks, he was caught and sentenced to 5 years in jail. Upon his release, Hare claimed to have turned over a new leaf, convinced he had discovered his true identity. However, within a year, he was back behind bars, this time for robbing a nightclub in Baltimore. On September 10, 1818, Joseph Thompson Hare was hanged before a crowd of 1,500 people, marking the end of his brutal and haunted life. Number 7. Michael Martin. Michael Martin, a swift-footed runner, found himself drawn into a life of crime after meeting a man named Captain Thunderbolt in a bar. Thunderbolt saw potential in the young 20-year-old and offered him a partnership in crime. Martin, known for his incredible speed, earned the nickname Captain Lightfoot, and together the two embarked on a spree of highway robberies. Armed with brass pistols, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot targeted wealthy travelers on the roads, but lived by a code. They never stole from women or the poor. Their exploits became legendary across Ireland, Scotland, and England. But eventually, Martin parted ways with Thunderbolt and made his way to the United States. Once in America, Martin revived his old habits, robbing unsuspecting travelers as he made his way down the East Coast. But his criminal career took a dark turn when his victims became more than just targets for theft. Martin's final crime was the murder of a Boston dignitary, Major Bray, and his wife. After stealing $12 from them, he tried to flee into the night, but law enforcement quickly caught up to him. While in jail, Martin made a desperate and violent escape attempt, launching a savage attack on a jailer that allowed him to flee into the countryside. However, his freedom was short-lived. He was eventually captured in Springfield. In 1821, Massachusetts executed Michael Martin by hanging for the crime of highway robbery. His execution marked a grim milestone. He became the first and last one person in Massachusetts to be hanged for this particular crime. Number 6. James Ford. James Ford was a man of many respectable titles: Tennessee delegate, county sheriff, justice of the peace, captain of the Livingston County Cavalry, and even overseer of the poor. On the surface, he appeared to be a pillar of his community, a man devoted to serving others. But beneath that facade lurked something far more sinister. Ford was not just an upstanding official. He was also known as Satan's ferryman. Alongside his many other skills, Ford was a highly experienced ferry operator who worked the waters of the infamous Cave-in-Rock region. However, Ford's ferry service was more than it appeared. By night, he became a ruthless counterfeiter and a deadly river pirate. Ford went on to establish the notorious Ford's Ferry Gang U, a band of criminals that preyed on unsuspecting travelers passing through the area. Under Ford's leadership, they unleashed terror on the region, robbing and murdering as they pleased. For much of the 1820s, Ford's gang thrived, leaving behind a trail of fear and death. But all reigns of terror come to an end. In 1833, a group of unidentified vigilantes decided they had had enough. Taking the law into their own hands, they tracked down James Ford and assassinated him, bringing a violent close to more than a decade of bloodshed. James Ford's dark legacy as Satan's ferryman and the leader of the Ford's ferry gang may have ended that day, but his story remains one of the most chilling in America's history of crime. Number 5. The Potts Inn. Even after the death of James Ford, lawlessness along Ford's ferry high-water road continued to thrive. But now, the danger had a new face and a new location. The Potts Inn, a seemingly charming property located in Potts Springs, became the next place where travelers unknowingly walked into danger. Owned and operated by Isaiah and Polly Potts, the inn catered primarily to those traveling by boat, offering weary travelers food and a place to rest. But what seemed like a sanctuary for the night quickly turned into a deadly trap. Whether a guest was renting a room for the evening or simply passing through, they often never left. The Potts couple had a grim method of disposing of their guests, murdering them and burying their bodies in a small grave nearby. The road to the inn became a path of no return for many unsuspecting travelers who unknowingly walked into the hands of these ruthless killers. One of the most chilling stories surrounding the Potts Inn involves their long-lost son, Billy Potts. Allegedly, Billy returned home after years away, but neither Isaiah nor Polly recognized him. According to legend, Billy Potts was led to the bar and murdered, falling victim to the same fate as countless others at the hands of his own parents. The Potts Inn may have appeared to be a welcoming place for travelers, but behind its doors, a world of deception and death awaited. The quiet property in Potts Springs became the final resting place for many who were unfortunate enough to pass through. Number 4. David Lewis. Enlisted in the Army at just 17 years old, but it wasn't long before he deserted, beginning a life on the run. Though he was sentenced to death by a military court, Lewis managed to escape, dodging his grim fate. Soon after, he surfaced in Vermont, embarking on a new career as a York counterfeiter. His life of crime seemed unstoppable, and when he was captured a second time, it was Melinda, his future wife, who helped him break free. After his escape, Lewis set up shop at the Doubling Gap Hotel, but he didn't stay there long. He turned his attention to wealthier targets, robbing those whom he believed would bring in the biggest profits. His reputation grew, and he became known as the Robin Hood of Pennsylvania. Though unlike the legendary outlaw, Lewis kept the riches for himself. Lewis's criminal spree eventually caught up to him. After a series of high-profile robberies, in which he targeted wagons of wealthy tourists, Lewis was injured and finally taken into custody. However, the end was near. His wounds became infected with gangrene, and in 1820 he died in prison, his life of crime cut short by the very injuries that sealed his fate. Though David Lewis was romanticized by some as a fonder Robin Hood figure, his story remains a cautionary tale of how a life of lawlessness can quickly unravel. Number 3. Henry Plummer was a man who walked a fine line between lawman and outlaw. In 1856, he was elected as Sheriff of Nevada City, California, serving 2 terms before being convicted of second-degree murder for killing his mistress' husband. Despite his crime, Plummer's time in prison was brief. After just 6 months in San Quentin, the governor granted him a war pardon, allowing him to return to Nevada City, where he was elected to the position of assistant marshal. But Plummer's taste for violence hadn't faded. In 1861, he fled the city to avoid prosecution for the murder of a man during a brawl at a local whorehouse. He eventually found his way to Idaho, where he joined up with a group of highwaymen. Under his leadership, the gang became known as the Innocents, infamous for robbing and killing miners who had struck gold. By Charter 1863 years, Plummer's reputation took another surprising turn when he was elected Sheriff of Bannock, Montana. But this new role didn't make him any less dangerous. Instead, it gave him the perfect cover to continue his criminal activities. Plummer secretly ran an efficient and deadly criminal ring, tipping off his gang members about gold shipments, and even providing them with protection from the law. All the while, Bannock's streets were terrorized by the innocents, who operated without fear of repercussions. Under Plummer's watch, over 100 locals were robbed and murdered. However, his reign of terror finally came to an end when over 2,000 settlers, transformed into vigilantes, took matters into their own hands. They apprehended Plummer and 2 of his men, who reportedly cried as they faced their fate, and hanged them from the very same gallows Plummer had intended for other criminals. The life of Henry Plummer, once a trusted lawman, is a chilling reminder of how power can corrupt and how the lines between justice and crime can become blurred. Number 2. Samuel Mason. In 1797, the infamous Cave in Rock became a refuge for Samuel Mason, a river pirate whose crimes spanned the Ohio River on the border between Illinois and Kentucky. This natural cave, already known as a sanctuary for highwaymen, became Mason's base of operations, where he and his band of criminals wreaked havoc on anyone unfortunate enough to enter their domain. Mason's method of luring victims was both cunning and deadly. He placed a sign near the cave that read, "Liquor Vault and House of Entertainment," inviting travelers to what they thought was a place of rest and hospitality. But once inside, they found themselves trapped, only to be brutally murdered by Mason and his gang. It wasn't just the sign that lured victims to their deaths. Mason's gang also used stranded women to draw travelers to the shore. Once they were on land, they stood no chance. Mason's crew killed anyone who crossed their path. To ensure that the bodies would never be found, they were dismembered, stuffed with rocks, and dumped into the river, where they sank to the bottom. Meanwhile, the valuables were gathered and transported to New Orleans and to be sold. Mason's reign of terror continued until one day in 2003, when Spanish officials apprehended him and his men. But the criminal mastermind wasn't finished yet. During their transport to American territory, Mason and his gang managed to kill the commander in charge of them and escaped on their way to Tennessee. However, Mason's days were numbered. A bounty on his head attracted the attention of his own gang members. In July 1803, Little Harp, one of Mason's most trusted partners, severed his head and brought it back to Mississippi to claim the reward for his capture. Samuel Mason's criminal career ended in a gruesome betrayal, his head becoming the final piece of his dark legacy. Number 1. The Harp Brothers. Micajah, Big Harp, and Wiley, Little Harp, are widely considered to be the first true serial killers in the United States. Their reign of terror spanned Kentucky and Tennessee, leaving behind a trail of mutilated bodies that struck fear into the hearts of frontier families. Unlike other outlaws who killed for profit, the Harps killed simply for the love of violence. Their bloodlust was so extreme that even other criminals found them too dangerous to tolerate, leading to their expulsion from the notorious Cave in Rock. But being outcasts didn't slow them down. The Harp brothers continued their gruesome spree of disembowelment, torture, and murder without discrimination. Victims of all shady ages, genders, and backgrounds fell to their savage brutality. The exact number of their victims remains unknown, though estimates place it between 25 and 50 Dawa-Chus. Their horrific acts came to a head in July 1799, when Big Harp met a grisly fate of his own. He was killed by a tomahawk strike, and to make an example of him, his head was severed and placed on a tree, where it stayed for a full 10 years. Meanwhile, Little Harp managed to evade capture, later joining Samuel Mason's gang. In a shocking twist, Little Harp betrayed Mason, beheading him and attempting to claim the bounty on his head. However, authorities quickly recognized Little Harp for who he really was, leading to his arrest and execution in Frontenac 1804. That wraps up today's journey into the twisted lives of America's forgotten highwaymen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's darker side, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another Odd Occasions adventure. Let me know in the comments which of these outlaw stories chilled you the most. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the oddities of our world.